That morning seemed ordinary for the city. People hurried past, carrying colorful umbrellas, dodging the puddles on the asphalt. The wind blew cold and the rain relentless. But amidst the hustle and bustle, one scene caught everyone's attention. A small, thin girl held slightly damp flowers, trying to sell them. She had no raincoat or proper shoes. Her clothes were soaked, but her gaze held a determination no one expected from someone so young. As cars passed, kicking up dirty water, she timidly extended her hand with the flowers. Many looked away, pretending not to notice. Have you ever witnessed anything like this? Stories like this touch our hearts and make us reflect. And if you enjoy these kinds of inspiring and moving stories, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you'll never miss out on stories that can change your day. Now, come back with me to that scene. ... With each flower she offered, she received a hasty no or even silence. But the girl didn't give up. Her bare feet shivered from the cold on the wet ground. Still, there was a strange hope in her face, as if she believed that someone at some point would stop to listen. In the midst of the rush, an elderly woman stopped for a moment. She looked at the girl, smiled pitifully, and placed some coins in her hand. The little girl thanked her as if she had received a treasure. And in a way, she had, because for her, every penny meant another chance to move forward. The scent of the flowers mixed with the rain created an almost poetic atmosphere. They weren't luxurious flowers, just simple daisies, some already bruised by time. Even so, she arranged them carefully as if they held a deeper meaning. There was a delicate care in every gesture. Meanwhile, across the street, a tall man in a well-pressed suit and a sturdy umbrella watched from afar. He seemed torn between continuing his walk or stopping for a better look. Something about the scene stirred within him, even though he tried to ignore it. His heart raced, but his mind told him, keep walking. The girl looked up and, for a moment, met the man's gaze. It was a quick but intense look. She smiled, a tired smile, but full of life. And in that smile was something no one else had noticed until then. The ability to touch deeply, where words cannot reach. People passed by as if it were just another rainy day. But for that girl, every minute was a struggle. The cold was punishing. Hunger was pressing, but there was an invisible force that kept her going. Maybe it was faith, maybe it was simply the need to survive. But it was there, steady as a rock. Amid the sound of the rain, she murmured small phrases. It was unclear. Whether they were prayers or just words of encouragement to herself, it'll work out. Someone will buy it. I'll get it. It was as if she were speaking directly to the gray sky, asking for an answer, a chance, a miracle. The man in the suit took a deep breath. He tried to swerve, but his feet faltered. Something inside him was beginning to burn, as if this scene wasn't just about a girl selling flowers. It was as if there was a secret hidden there, a link between his past and this present moment. The rain intensified, but the girl didn't move. Her body trembled, but her soul seemed unshakable. Those watching from afar might not realize it, but she was waging a silent battle against giving up. A battle many adults had already lost. A car sped past, splashing mud over her legs. For a second, she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, but didn't cry. She simply straightened her wet dress and clutched the flowers tighter, as if to say, nothing's going to knock me down today. The man on the other side could no longer hide it. His eyes were welling up, though he couldn't quite understand why. The scene seemed simple, but the weight it carried was enormous. He began walking toward the girl, slowly, as if approaching something sacred. The sound of the rain drowned out almost everything, but there was a strange silence between them. The girl noticed their approach and clutched the flowers to her chest. Her lips trembled, but her gaze remained steady. There was something in the way she viewed life that was not easily explained. With each step he took, more memories surfaced. Old images, fragments of a distant childhood, pains he thought he'd buried. His heart pounded as if time were about to reveal a secret he'd kept for years. The flowers, simple and fragile, seemed to shine in the rain like torches of hope. The girl didn't know it, but she was about to change not only her own destiny, but also that of those who watched her. Because sometimes God uses the little ones to awaken the most hardened hearts. Thunder split the sky, sending some passers-by running for cover. But he stayed. He stood before her, motionless, as if he finally understood he couldn't run away. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The girl lifted one of the flowers and held it out to him gently. Her gesture was shy, but it carried an indescribable strength. "Would you like to buy a flower, sir?" Her voice was low but firm, as if each word had been carefully chosen. The man didn't respond immediately. He remained silent, observing, and it was in that silence that something began to break inside him. because it wasn't just an offering of a flower, it was an invitation. An invitation to open one's heart, to see the invisible. Other people rushed past, barely noticing what was happening, but anyone who looked closely would see a scene beyond words. Two different worlds, two distinct stories, about to collide. The girl waited unhurriedly, as if she knew the man couldn't simply turn his back. Her eyes said more than any speech. They begged for attention, for compassion, for a shred of humanity. The wind blew her wet hair, and the rain ran down her face like tears. But she didn't cry. She stood there like a little warrior, a warrior selling flowers in the midst of the storm. The man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that moment. It was as if he were standing before a mirror that showed him everything he had tried to forget, and what no one knew was that this encounter was no coincidence. Tension hung in the air. He reached out, but not to take the flower right away. It was as if he wanted to touch that reality first, to feel that it was real. The girl, not quite understanding, just waited, trusting in the silence. His heart was pounding like a drum, and within him a soft voice seemed to whisper, "Stop. Look. Listen. This girl has something to show you." It was as if the sky itself were opening an invisible path before them. The flowers trembled in her small hands, but even fragile as they were, they held a unique beauty. A beauty that came not from perfection, but from resilience amidst the storm. The man finally picked up the flower. Touching it, he felt a rush of memories, emotions, and regrets. As if that simple petal held the key to something he had lost long ago. The girl smiled, a simple yet powerful smile. And in that instant, a flame ignited in his heart. This wasn't just an ordinary transaction. It was the beginning of a story no one could have imagined. The thunder echoed again, but he no longer noticed the rain. He was immersed in the moment, as if transported to another place. Something bigger was about to happen, and while the city continued its indifferent rush, there, on that wet street corner, two destinies were crossing paths, a flower girl and a businessman, and little did they know, nothing would ever be the same again. The man in the suit seemed out of place in the scene. His black umbrella contrasted with the hurried colors of the others, and his leather shoes gleamed despite the rain. He had the posture of someone accustomed to giving orders, to making decisions, but now, faced with the girl with the flowers, something in his expression wavered. He was well known in the city. He owned businesses, buildings, restaurants, one of those names that appears in business newspapers. But there, in the middle of the wet street, he wasn't the businessman who emerged. He was just a man, carrying within himself a silence. No. One recognized. His eyes roamed over every detail. The girl's small hands, the way she held the flowers, the smile that persisted despite the rain. He couldn't understand why he couldn't pull away. It was as if an invisible force held him captive in that moment. Deep down, he was used to ignoring it. Over the years, he'd learned to look away from scenes like this. But now, it was different. With every step, it felt like the entire past was being pulled to the surface, ready to explode. And there was something strange. Very strange. The way that girl looked at him was unlike the others. There was no fear, no shame, no flattery. It was a pure, direct, almost transparent gaze, as if she saw something beyond what ordinary eyes could see. The man tried to swallow hard. His heart was racing, and his hands trembled slightly, hidden in his coat pocket. How could he explain this? Why was a little girl, a stranger, moving him so much? What was going on inside him at that moment? Cars honked, the city bustled, but for him, the world had stopped. It was as if the rain were merely a backdrop for a revelation yet to come. A revelation he hadn't even dared imagine. His name was Richard, a respected name associated with success and achievement, but also a name that carried stories no one knew. Stories he had buried beneath reports, meetings, and million-dollar figures. Richard wasn't a cruel man, but he had hardened the business world had taught him to be cold, to not get attached, to not look back. But in front of that girl, his entire armor seemed to silently shatter. He took a deep breath. He tried to convince himself it was just charity, that he should give some money and move on. But his heart wouldn't accept that excuse. It wasn't about charity. It was about something much bigger, something he couldn't yet name. The flowers in her hands seemed to come to life before him. They were fragile, but they held a resilient beauty, surviving the storm. In a way, they were like he himself had once been, weathering the storms of life, without breaking completely. With every passing second, Richard felt a growing uneasiness. It was as if he were being called, invited to look beyond the surface, as if someone from above were whispering, "Don't run away this time, stay. Listen." A flash of memory came to him. A wet alley, a childhood marked by loss, the sight of his own mother selling small things to survive. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the memory away. But he couldn't. The girl stood there, standing firm, offering her flowers, and her every gesture seemed to poke at old wounds within him. Wounds he thought had healed, but which now burned again as if they had never healed. Richard tried to maintain his composure. He adjusted his tie, straightened his body, but inside, he was shattered. It was as if fate had placed a living mirror before him, a reflection he couldn't ignore. The people around him had no idea what was going on. To them, he was just a businessman standing in front of a poor girl. But to him, it was a reunion with something lost. A calling impossible to avoid. The sound of the rain sounded like a heavenly choir at that moment. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, and an old phrase he had heard as a child came to mind. "Let the little children come to me, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He had never understood it so clearly as now. His heart was pounding, almost painful. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pity. It was something deeper. It was recognition. As if, by looking at that girl, he was looking at his own destiny. Richard, the man of millions, the ruthless businessman, stood there, vulnerable before a soaking wet child holding fragile flowers. And for the first time in a long time, he felt human. The girl tilted her head, looking at him as if she knew something. Her gaze wasn't accusatory, wasn't begging. It was serene, almost hopeful, as if she believed he had a role in this story. He tried to smile, but his face couldn't hide the emotion. A tear threatened to fall, and Richard held it back with difficulty. He didn't want to appear weak, but deep down he knew it wasn't weakness. It was liberation. Meanwhile, the city chugged along indifferently. People hurried along, unaware that, on that corner, an entire life was being confronted. Richard sensed something was about to change forever. He reached out hesitantly, like someone touching fire, unsure if they'll get burned. And in that simple gesture, his entire life seemed to weigh down on his shoulders. It was more than just picking a flower. It was crossing an invisible boundary. The girl's eyes shone for a moment, as if she'd been expecting that gesture all along. She didn't flinch. She simply handed over the flower with the naturalness of someone offering a piece of their own heart. Richard picked up the flower, and as he touched it, he felt his entire past explode within him. As if each petal were a thread pulling at buried memories, hidden secrets, pain still crying out for healing. He almost dropped the flower, such was the intensity of his feeling. But he held on tightly, as if that small gesture were his last chance at redemption. The rain fell hard, streaming down his face, mingling with tears he could no longer hide. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, but he didn't know if he was crying from pain, relief, or hope. And it was there, in front of that girl, that Richard realized something. Sometimes God finds us in unexpected ways in the most unlikely places, and almost always he uses people we would never imagine to speak to us. The girl smiled again. She said nothing, but her silence was more eloquent than any words. It was as if she were saying, "I've been waiting for you." Richard felt his knees weaken. He could no longer maintain the pose of the great businessman. He was about to surrender, not to her, but to what this moment represented. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to explode. Something was about to happen, something big, something that would change everything. And on that soaked street corner, with a simple flower in his hands, the mysterious businessman was about to discover that his life would never be the same. Richard held the flower in his hands, but it seemed to hold much more than that. Its weight was heavier than a few wet petals. It was as if that small offering had tugged at a hidden thread in his soul, bringing back memories he never wanted to revisit. The images came quickly, powerfully. A small room, a leaky ceiling, the smell of stale bread, his exhausted mother, trying to sell small improvised flower arrangements to pay the rent. He, still a boy, running the streets with empty pockets. His heart was racing. It had been decades since he'd thought about it. The success, the businesses, the buildings that now bore his name. All of it was built on a foundation of oblivion. Richard believed he had buried the past, but the truth was, it was merely asleep. Every time he looked at the girl, more memories came flooding back. They weren't chosen memories, they were painful ones. The hunger, the cold, the fear of losing everything overnight. And, above all, the memory of his mother's faith, always saying, "Trust my son, God will not abandon us." He took a deep breath, but the air felt heavy. The noisy city around him faded. Only he, the girl, and the memories that came back like merciless waves remained. It was as if he were trapped between the present and his childhood, unable to escape. Richard remembered the smell of the wilted flowers his mother had arranged so carefully. He remembered the nights he'd cried in secret, promising himself that when he grew up he'd never go through that again. It was that promise that had hardened him. But now, faced with that girl, everything crumbled. Because he saw in her the same courage his mother had once possessed, He saw in her eyes the same flame that had so often illuminated the dark days of his childhood, and it left him devastated. Her fingers gripped the flower tightly, almost crushing it. She didn't want to remember. She didn't want to feel, but it was impossible to avoid. This encounter wasn't random. It was as if fate itself had decided to expose her open wounds. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. His throat felt clogged, full of words that had never been spoken. It was strange. That silence said more than any prepared speech he usually gave at business meetings, and it was in this silence that an even more painful memory surfaced. The last night he'd seen his mother, he'd been so young, but he'd never forgotten. Her cough, her weakness, her struggle to smile as she said, "Richard, never stop believing that God will guide you." Tears began to fall, mixing with the rain. He hurriedly wiped them away, but it was no use. There was no hiding it anymore. The respected businessman was now just a broken man, remembering where he came from. The girl watched silently. She didn't seem scared or confused. She just stared, as if she understood the pain he carried, as if she were a little angel, sent only to remind him of who he truly was. Richard closed his eyes, and for a moment he was that cold, barefoot boy again. Hugging his mother in the midst of the storm, life had changed, but the feeling was the same. That fight for survival was still within him. He felt ashamed. Ashamed for having forgotten where he came from, ashamed for having turned a blind eye to so many other children who were once like him, ashamed for having turned his promise to never suffer again into armor against the world. But, along with the shame, a glimmer of hope was born. Because if those memories were returning, perhaps there was still time to heal. Maybe this encounter was the opportunity to reclaim something that should never have been lost. The girl held her flowers tightly, just as her mother had done. And in that simple gesture, Richard saw a powerful lesson. Even in difficult times, it's possible to continue offering beauty to the world. Even when everything seems against you, you can still believe. A shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't just a coincidence. That girl was a mirror, a living reminder. And deep down, Richard knew he couldn't just turn his back and walk away. Something bigger was calling him. The images of the past lingered. The smell of cheap coffee, the makeshift bed, the constant fear of not having anything to eat the next day. Everything came rushing back, and with it came the memory of the faith that kept her mother going. He remembered seeing his mother on her knees, praying quietly in the middle of the night. And in that moment he understood. It wasn't just her effort, it was trust in something greater. A trust he had lost along the way. Richard took a deep breath and looked up at the gray sky. Maybe, just maybe, this encounter was the answer to an old prayer. Not the girl's, not his, but his mother's, who was no longer there. A prayer that had crossed time and reached this day. His eyes returned to the girl. She remained firm, motionless, as if part of the scenery, but he knew it wasn't just that. This child was the key to something that had yet to be revealed. His heart was pounding, almost painful. He wanted to run away, but he couldn't. He wanted to forget, but he couldn't. It was as if he were stuck on a path with no return, and with every step something new revealed itself. He reached out again, this time without hesitation. He lightly touched another flower, but it wasn't for the purchase. It was as if he were searching for a connection, an invisible link that could hold him amidst the whirlwind of memories. The girl smiled again, that serene smile that seemed to hold secrets. And in that smile there was something that made him feel welcome, as if to say, "You are not alone. You never were." Richard closed his eyes for a moment and let the memory flow without resistance. He saw his mother's face, heard her voice, felt her embrace, and he understood that life was giving him a new chance to see. The tears continued, but they weren't just tears of pain anymore. There was something liberating about them, something that cleansed the soul, that purified the hardened heart. As if each drop washed away years of oblivion, he opened his eyes again and stared at the girl. "I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was about to discover something even greater. Something that linked his life to the fate of that little flower." Cellar. The rain had been falling steadily, but now it felt different. It wasn't just a storm anymore. It was a baptism, a new beginning, a preparation for what was to come. And in that moment, Richard realized the past had not been forgotten. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be remembered. And that moment was now. Richard held the little flower as if holding a secret. That fragile petal seemed to carry more weight than any $1 million contract he'd ever signed. It was as if, suddenly, his life had been summed up in that moment. That simple gesture held something profound. The girl held out another flower. Her eyes glistened in the rain, and she said softly, "Every flower has a story, sir." Richard frowned, not quite understanding. But there was a firmness in her voice that belied her age. He hesitated. He almost asked what she meant, but chose to just listen. The silence between them had a strange force, as if the entire sky were paying attention. Then the girl added, "Flowers always find a way to grow, even in the mud." Those words struck a chord in him. It was a simple yet powerful truth. Her life, his life, all their lives, each trying to flourish amid their own storms. Richard felt his heart sink. The girl handed over another flower, a bruised daisy. This is a reminder that beauty can also exist when there's almost nothing left. Richard looked at the flower with unexpected tenderness. It was as if he were listening to a lesson in the form of petals. He began to realize he wasn't just buying flowers. He was buying fragments of hope. Each flower was a reminder, a living parable. Suddenly, it stopped being a transaction and became a divine encounter. Richard swallowed hard. He, who had so often prided himself on understanding numbers, contracts, and investments, was now learning from a soaking wet little girl. And what no one knew was he needed to hear it more than anyone. The girl remained calm. Her gaze held a steady sweetness, like someone who knows life's pains but won't let them dim the light. "Flowers heal, sir," she said softly, almost like a revelation. Richard thought of all the wounds he carried, the losses, the mistakes, the distance from the people he once loved. Suddenly, it seemed those flowers had the power to touch every scar hidden within him. He picked another flower, and another memory surfaced. His mother, smiling even though she was tired, arranging flowers in an old vase. Back then, he hadn't understood why she placed so much value on such simple things. Now he finally understood. The tears returned silently. He tried to hide them, but the girl noticed. She didn't laugh, didn't judge. She simply handed him another flower as if to say, "It's okay, you can cry." Richard felt small, vulnerable, but there was something liberating about it. It was as if by accepting those flowers, he was also accepting the possibility of healing. Not just from the past, but from the hardness that had gripped his soul. The rain fell harder, but he no longer cared. The flowers, wet and fragile, remained beautiful in his hand. He thought, maybe I need them more than she needs my money. The girl smiled, seeing that he was beginning to understand. Flowers remind us that there's always a new beginning. Even when everything seems over, they bloom again. Richard swallowed. It was exactly what he needed to hear. A warmth filled his chest. It was different. It was new, as if each flower were a prayer in disguise, a direct message from God, reaching him in the midst of the storm. He closed his eyes for a moment. Clutching one of the flowers to his chest, he felt the soft scent mix with the smell of rain. It was simple yet transformative. Suddenly, everything seemed clear. Those flowers weren't just merchandise. They were bridges. Bridges between the past and the present, between pain and hope, between him and something much greater. Richard could no longer hold back his tears. He cried like a boy, without shame, without fear. The girl remained there, firm, offering flowers. As if offering life, a group of people passed by, curious but soon moved away. To them, it was just a man buying flowers from a poor child. To Richard, it was a silent revolution taking place within his heart. He picked another flower, this time with reverence. As if standing before something sacred, he felt each petal tell a story, a lesson, a piece of eternity. "Flowers heal wounds no one sees," the girl said, almost in a whisper. Richard shivered. It was exactly what he needed to hear. He didn't know how that child had so much wisdom, but he knew it wasn't by chance. The flowers in his hand formed a small bouquet, but to him it was much more than that. It was a testament to the fact that there was still time to start over, time to be someone different. He looked up at the girl and asked, "How do you know all this?" She just smiled. There was no answer, just a mystery that seemed bigger than herself. Richard felt a gentle presence, as if God were there in the midst of the rain, whispering through that child. It was impossible to deny. He was being called to something beyond logic. The wind blew stronger, scattering a few petals to the ground. Richard watched them fly like little messages from heaven. He realized that sometimes beauty lies precisely in what we cannot hold. The girl held out the last flower. "This one is special," she said with a deep look. Richard took it carefully, as if it were a treasure. And in that instant he felt something different. It wasn't just healing, it was a promise. Her heart filled with a hope she hadn't felt in years. A timid hope, but real. As if the flower were saying, "The worst is over. The best is yet to come." He looked around. The city hurried on, but for him, time stood still. It was just him, the flowers, and the girl. And something inside him told him that this wasn't the last time he'd see that look. Richard knew. There was still more to discover. The flowers had healed him from within, but there was something else, something hidden, that still needed to be revealed. And as he held the small bouquet, his heart transformed. He felt that the true encounter was still just beginning. Richard clutched the makeshift bouquet so tightly that his hands trembled. The soaked flowers seemed alive, as if they pulsed with his heart. The weight of that moment crushed him inside. It was no longer just a gesture. It was a revelation. He tried to stand up straight, as he always had before the world, but his knees began to weaken. It was as if all the weight of the years, the choices, the losses, fell upon him at once. And then, before the girl, Richard broke down. He fell to his knees on the wet sidewalk, oblivious to the stares around him. The rain washed over his face, but the tears were stronger. Passersby stopped in surprise. Some whispered, others stared blankly. After all, what was such a respected businessman doing kneeling before a poor little girl selling flowers? The girl watched him silently. There was no surprise in her eyes, only tenderness, as if she knew that moment had to happen, as if she were merely witnessing something much greater. Richard lowered his head and cried. He cried like he hadn't cried since he was a child. The sobs tore at his throat and he didn't care. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to be fragile. The flowers fell to the ground, a few petals scattering across the wet sidewalk. But for Richard, this wasn't a loss. It was a liberation. It was as if he were shedding a suit of armor he'd carried his entire life. A woman stopped and put her hand to her mouth in shock. A young man took out his cell phone, trying to record the scene, but Richard couldn't see anyone. In that moment, the world had disappeared. Only he, the girl, and God existed. He looked up at her. "You have no idea what's going on inside me," he murmured, his voice breaking. But she just smiled as if she already knew everything. "Sometimes we have to fall down to get up again," she said with the simplicity of a child. But those words echoed like thunder in Richard's heart. He put his hand to his chest, feeling a strange but pleasant ache. It wasn't physical pain. It was his soul being broken and rebuilt at the same time, as if a part of him had finally found peace. Some passersby tried to approach, but soon moved away, sensing something sacred about the scene. The silence was dense, heavy, almost solemn. Richard reached out, picking up the fallen flowers again. His hands trembled, but he held on as if holding on to a chance at life. "These flowers saved me," he said tearfully. The girl also crouched down, reaching his level. "It's not the flowers, sir. It's what they remind you of." Those words pierced his heart like a real arrow. He couldn't explain it, but he sensed. This girl wasn't ordinary. There was a wisdom about her that didn't come from experience alone. It was as if she were a channel for something much greater. Richard closed his eyes and whispered a prayer he hadn't said in years. "Lord, ... if this is what I'm thinking, show me what to do." It was a simple request, but true. When he opened his eyes, the girl was still smiling. It was a small smile, but full of hope. And Richard realized that smile was the answer he so desperately needed. Her heart was shattered, yet at the same time whole as never before. It was a paradox impossible to explain. Only those who had experienced such a revelation could understand. The people around him continued to watch, but Richard didn't care. For the first time, he didn't care about status, image, or pride. He was naked before the truth. The girl took one of the flowers and placed it gently in his hand. "Stand up, sir. There is more for you to discover." Her voice seemed to carry a soft but unquestionable command. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his strength. His knees were still shaking, but something new was already being born inside him. A small flame but real. Richard looked at the girl as if gazing at a miracle. "Who are you?" he asked in a barely audible whisper. But she didn't answer. She just kept smiling. A profound silence fell over the place. The rain now seemed lighter, as if the sky were watching too. It was as if the entire universe had stopped just to watch that moment. His heart was pounding, racing. He knew he didn't have all the answers yet, but he had something even more important. The certainty that this encounter would change everything. Richard wiped his face, but the tears kept falling. "I don't know why, but I feel like I need to stay here." The girl nodded as if she already knew he would say that. Passersby began to disperse, but the scene remained etched in the hearts of all who witnessed it. A powerful man on his knees before a poor child, an image impossible to forget, and deep down, Richard knew this was just the beginning. There was something hidden in the past, something that needed to be revealed, something that connected his life to that girl in a way he didn't yet understand. He took a deep breath and clutched the flower to his chest. "Lord, ... guide me," he murmured. And in that instant he felt the next step was about to happen. The girl simply held his hand firm and calm, and it was in that gesture that Richard understood. He was no longer alone, but what he didn't know was that the answers he was looking for were much closer than he imagined. And so, amidst the rain and tears, the unexpected encounter became the beginning of a revelation that would change Richard's life forever. Richard was still kneeling when something inside him began to burn. It wasn't the cold of the rain or the weariness of his bones. It was memory. Insistent, returning in waves too strong to ignore. He closed his eyes and suddenly he was back in his childhood. He saw himself small, fragile, holding his mother's hand as they walked down the same street. She carried makeshift flowers, smiling even in the face of hardship. His heart sank. That scene was identical to the one he was experiencing now. A girl selling flowers in the rain, just like his mother did. Past and present collided in a frightening way. He felt a lump in his throat. It couldn't be a coincidence. That girl wasn't just any saleswoman. She was the living reflection of something he'd tried to bury for decades. The child's gaze struck him. It was as if she had inherited the same glimmer of hope her mother had carried. And in that moment, Richard knew he could run no further. A painful memory surfaced. The night he had lost his mother. He was still a boy, and there were no flowers that night, only tears. She had left holding his hand and saying, "God will never abandon you." Richard burst into tears. That memory had never left him, but he had always tried to suppress it. Now, faced with that girl, it was impossible to ignore. It was as if life was forcing him to face his greatest pain. The girl touched his hand gently. The simple gesture brought an unexpected, almost familiar warmth. Richard shivered. That touch reminded him of his mother's affection. It was as if, in some mysterious way, she were still there. He stared into the girl's eyes. For an instant, he saw not just a child but also the reflection of his mother. The same look of tenderness, the same quiet strength. It was frightening and, at the same time, comforting. Richard stammered, "Why you? Why you, of all people?" But the girl didn't answer. She just squeezed his hand firmly, as if to say, "You already know the answer." The tears flowed uncontrollably. He understood, but he didn't want to accept it, because the revelation was too painful. That girl was the echo of what he had lost, the living reminder of the promise he made to his mother and never kept. A weight crushed his chest. He remembered his promise. "I will win, Mom. I will never go through this again." And yes, he did. He built empires. But along the way, he forgot the most important things: faith and compassion. Now, kneeling before a poor child, life exacted its toll. The pain he'd tried to suppress for years returned with a vengeance. But along with it came a chance for redemption. Richard whispered, "Mom, forgive me." The words escaped through sobs. He didn't care if anyone heard. This was the truest confession of his life. The girl continued to smile. There was no judgment on her face, only understanding, as if she were there to welcome, not condemn. Suddenly, Richard noticed something strange. That street, that place, it wasn't just similar to his childhood, it was the same place, the same spot where his mother used to sell flowers when life was hardest. He looked around, stunned. Everything made sense now. He was reliving his own story decades later on the same rain-soaked ground. It wasn't a coincidence. It was fate. His heart sank even more. The girl wasn't his mother, but she was the missing link. It was as if God had chosen this child to remind him of where he came from and what truly mattered. He cried so hard he could barely speak, but the girl just waited patiently, as if she knew every tear was part of the healing process. Richard began to tremble. The entire past was there, wide open before him. There was nowhere left to run. The revelation was harsh but necessary. He clutched the flowers to his chest and murmured, "I didn't keep my promise, Mother. I lost my way." The confession cut him to the quick, but it also brought relief. The girl tilted her head and said softly, "It's never too late to come back." For the first time in years, he felt there was still a chance. That maybe this pain was just the beginning of a transformation, but along with hope came fear. It was an intense conflict, one that made him tremble even more. He looked at the girl and asked, "Why? Now, why me?" She just smiled mysteriously. "Because you needed to remember." Those words echoed in his mind. He needed to face the pain so he could heal. The revelation was painful, but also liberating. The rain continued, but now it seemed to have a different meaning. It wasn't just a storm, it was purification. It was as if each drop washed away a piece of his soul. Richard took a deep breath and wiped his eyes. He was ready to accept the truth, but he knew this was only the beginning. There was still much to discover. He squeezed the girl's hand, feeling a glimmer of hope. He knew he needed to follow her. Listen, learn. Something inside him told him. The answers were yet to come. And as he stood, still trembling, Richard understood that the painful revelation was only the first step in a much larger journey. Richard's eyes were still watery when the girl came closer. She seemed calm even with the rain running down her face. The girl held up a flower and said softly, "Did you know that God never forgets us?" Richard shivered. That simple sentence struck his heart like an arrow. He hadn't heard anything like it in years. For a moment he wanted to smile, but he couldn't. The weight of the past was still there, but those words were like a breath of fresh air in a stuffy room. The girl continued, Sometimes we go through dark days, but God always sends a light. It could be a person, a word, or even a flower. Richard's eyes widened, impressed by so much wisdom in someone so small. He shook his head, almost in disbelief. "And how do you know that, girl?" she replied without hesitation. "My grandmother always says that faith is like a seed. If you plant it, it grows, even in hard soil." These words stirred old memories in him. He remembered hearing his mother say something similar. His heart sank even more, but at the same time he felt a flame rekindle. The girl seemed in no hurry. She spoke slowly, with pauses that made each sentence sink in. "If we only look at the rain, we'll think it's all over. But if we look at the sky, we'll remember the sun always comes back." Richard was silent, absorbing every word. For the first time in a long time, he felt small in the face of someone's faith. Small, but also inspired. He tried to ask something, but his voice faltered. The girl noticed and smiled. Those words broke the last resistance within him. The tears came, back with a vengeance, but this time they were different. They weren't just tears of pain, they were also tears of relief. Of hope. The girl held up another flower, even more damaged by the rain. "See this one. A lot of people would throw it away, but I believe that even damaged flowers have value. And we are like that too." Richard narrowed his eyes. It was as if she'd described exactly what he felt. Hurt, broken, but still brave. It left him breathless for a few seconds. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "You speak in a way I've never heard before." The girl smiled and said, "It's because I believe. When we believe, the words come with force." Her faith seemed contagious. Richard began to feel a calm he hadn't known in a long time. It was as if each word were a drop of healing on his old wounds. She then said, her voice firm, "It doesn't matter what we've been through, God can always write a new story." It was exactly what he needed to hear. For a moment, Richard stared up at the gray sky. The rain was still falling, but it seemed less heavy. It was as if the sky confirmed every word the girl had said. He lowered his head and murmured, "But I failed too much. I made too many mistakes." Before he could continue, the girl interrupted, "And who doesn't make mistakes? What matters is not where we fall, but whether we decide to get up." These words completely disarmed him. He felt a strange peace, as if someone had lifted a huge weight from his shoulders. For the first time, he believed that perhaps there was still a way forward for him. The girl remained firm. "Do you know why I sell flowers in the rain? Because I believe that every person deserves to take a little piece of hope home with them, even when it seems meaningless." Richard couldn't help but smile, even through his tears. That girl wasn't just a saleswoman. Her every word was a lesson in faith disguised as simplicity. He asked softly, "And you never get discouraged?" She shook her head. "Of course you do. But when you do, I remember that God never lets go of my hand. And then I keep going." His heart raced. Those words echoed deep within. How many times had he felt alone? How many times had he thought no one cared? Now he understood that he had never truly been abandoned. The girl handed him another flower, saying, "Each flower is a prayer. And when someone accepts it, it's as if they're accepting a little of God's presence too." Richard swallowed, overcome with emotion. He looked at the flowers in his hand and realized he wasn't just holding petals. He was holding living prayers, signs of the faith he so desperately needed to rediscover. The girl concluded softly, "Flowers die quickly, but God's love never ends." Richard closed his eyes and let those words sink deep into his soul. Suddenly, the rain didn't seem so cold. The wind didn't sound so harsh. It was as if through that child, God had changed the atmosphere around him. He took a deep breath and said, "You brought me something I haven't felt in a long time." "Faith," the girl smiled tenderly. "It wasn't me, sir, it was him." Richard was speechless. He just held her hand, silent, but just the beginning of an even greater revelation. Richard was still holding the girl's hand when a strange sensation ran through him. It wasn't just emotion. It was as if something was trying to connect the invisible dots of his life. He couldn't explain it, but he sensed there was more to the story. The girl looked at him calmly, as if she knew a secret he hadn't yet discovered. And the more Richard studied that childlike face, the more the past seemed to blend with the present. He took a deep breath, trying to understand. "Why do I feel like I already know you?" he asked, almost without meaning to. The girl just smiled, not responding. But that silence said more than words. A shiver ran down his spine. It was impossible to deny. There was something familiar about that child, not the face itself, but the look in his eyes. The same look he had seen so many times in the mirror as a boy. Richard brought his hand to his face, confused. Memories came flooding back. His difficult childhood, his mother selling flowers, the nights of prayer, everything seemed to be reliving before him. But why? The girl broke the silence. That was exactly how he felt. He thought of all the places he could have been that morning. Meetings, appointments, business. But no. Back to close a cycle, or perhaps to open a new one. The girl picked another flower and said, "This one is special. It's the last one left in the basket." Richard received it carefully, as if it were a treasure. His heart raced. It was as if every detail had been carefully orchestrated. The place, the rain, the girl, the flowers, everything conspired to show that there was an invisible bond uniting their stories. Richard began to remember his father, who had left too soon. He'd never understood why life had been so hard. But now I was beginning to see, even in the pain. There was a thread of purpose. He looked back at the girl and murmured, "You didn't come into my life by accident, did you?" She shook her head gently. No words were needed. The silence confirmed it. Richard felt a lump in his throat. "But what is our bond? Why do I feel like you're part of my own story?" The girl just held his hand tighter. The tears returned, but now they weren't just tears of pain. There was hope mixed in. Hope that this bond wasn't just a memory, but also the promise of something new. Richard remembered a phrase his mother had always said, "God writes stories we don't always understand at first." And now, finally, he was beginning to believe it. People around him hurried past, unaware of the intensity of what was happening on that sidewalk. But inside Richard, everything was changing. He watched the girl, intrigued. Who was she, after all? An ordinary child, an angel in disguise. A living reminder of his past? Or perhaps all of these at once. The girl then said, "Sometimes the bond isn't of blood, but of purpose." Richard felt a chill. It was as if she had opened a door inside him. He remembered being young and dreaming of helping people. Before he lost himself in business, he had sworn he would make a difference. Now, that forgotten promise was coming back with a vengeance. Richard realized that perhaps the bond between them was precisely that, the chance to fulfill the promise he had left behind. The girl was the calling he could no longer ignore. He clutched the flower to his chest as if it were a symbol of their shared destiny. Each petal seemed to confirm there was something greater uniting those two lives. The silence between them was heavy. It needed no explanation. It was as if they both knew they were connected in a way that surpassed logic. Richard murmured, "You changed my life in just a few minutes." The girl smiled. Sometimes all it takes is one encounter to change. He felt his knees weaken again, but this time not from pain. It was from gratitude. Gratitude for that encounter, for that bond, for that revelation that was yet to come. The rain was beginning to ease, and a faint ray of light broke through the clouds. Richard looked up at the sky and felt it was a sign. Destiny was being revealed, but along with the light came a new mystery, because deep in his heart, Richard knew there was more to be revealed. Something still hidden, waiting for the right moment. He took a deep breath and said to the girl, "I don't know how, but I feel like our lives are intertwined." She simply replied, "You'll understand soon." Those words echoed within him. Soon. What did that mean? What secret was still hidden? And as he held that last flower, Richard realized the bond of destiny was not complete. There were still pieces to be discovered. Richard remained silent for a few moments. Feeling the weight and lightness of that encounter, his heart still ached from the memories, but something was different now. It was as if a new beat echoed within him, softer, more alive. He took a deep breath, looking at the girl with tears in his eyes. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he confessed. But deep down, he knew she did. Her every word seemed calculated by heaven itself. Richard had always believed that transformation was something you could read in books, sermons, or motivational speeches. But there, in the rain, he felt it happening inside him. It wasn't theory, it was reality. The pride that had sustained him for years began to crumble. Power, money, titles, none of them seemed to matter anymore. What mattered now was what blossomed. Within him, a broken heart being mended. He looked at the flowers in his hands and thought, I was like them, crushed by life but still alive. And now, perhaps, ready to bloom again. The thought filled him with hope. The girl smiled as if she'd read his thoughts. "You look different," she said simply. Richard laughed through his tears. "I don't even recognize myself anymore." It was true. He didn't recognize himself. The cold, business-focused man seemed to have been left behind. The Richard kneeling on that sidewalk was different, vulnerable, human, awake. He stood up slowly, his knees still shaking, but this time he didn't feel weak. On the contrary, he felt empowered, as if he'd been given a new chance to be who he truly was. Richard looked around. The street was still wet, but it felt different. It was as if it had taken on new colors, new meanings. The world hadn't changed, he had. The girl said softly, "When we change inside, everything around us seems to change too." He nodded. Impressed by the depth of those words, Richard began to think about all the people he'd left behind. Partners, friends, family. How many times had he chosen business over people? The pain of this reflection was intense, but also necessary. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I must repair what I have destroyed." The girl squeezed his hand and replied, "A transformed heart always finds a way to repair." His heart was racing. It was as if for the first time in a long time he had a direction, not a business plan, not a profit chart, but a real purpose. Richard smiled, still crying. "I thought I had conquered life, but now I see I was lost." The girl said nothing. She just looked at him tenderly. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. And in that moment he made the silent decision to never live the same way again. It was as if a burden had fallen from his shoulders. The weight of arrogance, indifference, and pride, it all dissolved in the rain that washed away his tears. Richard looked up at the gray sky. "Thank you, Lord, for not giving up on me." That simple prayer was the most sincere he had ever prayed. He felt a gentle warmth course through his body, as if the heavens themselves had responded. It was impossible to explain in words, but it was real. Richard looked at the girl again. "You brought me back to life." She just shook her head. "It wasn't me, it was him." Those words echoed within him. The transformation wasn't just emotion. It was something spiritual, profound, eternal. He thought about how many times he'd mocked people who talked about faith. Now he understood believing wasn't weakness. It was strength. A strength he himself was rediscovering. Richard gave a genuine smile, his first in years. "I feel like a new man." The girl replied simply, "So be it." Those two words were like a decree in his heart. To be, not just to have, not just to conquer, to be. To be human, to be a father, to be a friend, to be a man of faith. The rain was beginning to stop and a ray of light broke through the clouds. Richard felt it was a sign. It wasn't the end of the storm, but the beginning of something new. He took a deep breath, determined. "I will no longer live for myself. I will live to make a difference." Those words weren't just intention, they were commitment. The girl smiled with a special sparkle in her eyes. Richard realized she knew exactly what was going on inside. He felt an immense desire to embrace that child. And when he embraced her, it was as if he were embracing his own mother, his lost childhood, his forgotten faith. It was the embrace of restoration. The people still watching the scene did not understand, but those with spiritual eyes would know. A heart was being transformed before their eyes. Richard slowly released the girl, still emotional. "I'll change no matter what," she replied. "Then it's already started." He smiled again, this time firmly. Yes, it had already begun. The old Richard was behind him. The new Richard was taking his first steps, but deep down he knew. The real test was yet to come. The transformation was real, but it would need to be put to the test in the next chapters of his life. Richard stood, but he looked different. His shoulders, once heavy with pride, now felt lighter. There was a new peace in his expression. The rain slowly stopped, as if even the sky knew something new was about to begin. He looked at the girl with gratitude in his eyes. "I can't just walk away and pretend nothing happened," he said firmly. She smiled, as if she'd already expected those words. Richard pulled his wallet from his pocket, but the girl shook her head. "It's not about money, sir. It never was." He froze, struck by the clarity of that statement. It was true. It wasn't about money. It was about destiny. Still, he knew. He had to do something. He couldn't let her return home barefoot and with an empty basket. His heart pounded with the certainty that he had a mission. He asked, "Where do you live? Who takes care of you?" The girl looked away, a little shy. "I live with my grandmother. She always says all we need is faith." Those words struck him like a bolt of lightning. Faith, once again, that word emerged as the key to everything. He smiled through his tears. "Your grandmother is wise. I'd like to meet her someday." The girl nodded but said nothing. It was as if the right time hadn't yet arrived. And Richard respected this silence. He understood that some answers would only come at the right time. As he walked beside her, he felt each step take him further away from the man he had been and closer to who he was meant to be. It was the beginning of a new road. He looked at the flowers he held. Each one seemed to hold a promise, a new life, a second chance, a fresh start. Richard knew he would never look at flowers the same way again. He paused for a moment and took a deep breath. "Today, something inside me was reborn," he confessed. The girl simply replied, "This is what needed to happen." Her words were simple, but they carried a power he would never forget. It wasn't ordinary advice. That his life had taken a new direction? Richard began to think about everything he could do from that day forward. Social projects, helping children, a life focused on something bigger than himself. For the first time in a long time, he had a purpose. He smiled at the girl. You gave me more than flowers. You gave me a new life." She simply inclined her head, without vanity, as if she knew she was just fulfilling a mission. As they walked together down the still wet street, people looked at them curiously. But for Richard, nothing else mattered. He just needed to move forward. The girl paused for a moment and said, "Don't forget, sir. When the storm returns, look up at the sky. There will always be sunshine behind the clouds." Richard swallowed. It was as if those words were a pact, a reminder for the difficult days ahead. He knew he would cherish it forever. He knelt one last time, not in pain, but in reverence. He murmured. Richard felt it was like a sign that the heavens were smiling down on him too. He stood up, took a deep breath and said, "This is just the beginning. I don't know how, but I will honor this meeting." The girl replied, "Then it's already done." Her words echoed in his mind. It was as if I had been given a mission I didn't yet fully understand, but I was willing to fulfill. Richard didn't know how he would explain this to the world, but inside there was no doubt. His life had been transformed. His once hardened heart now beat with hope again. He looked around and noticed that the city remained the same, cars passing by. But for him, everything had changed. The girl took his hand again. "It's your turn now, sir." Richard squeezed firmly, feeling the weight and lightness of that responsibility. He knew the story didn't end there. It was just the first chapter of a new journey. The future was wide open, full of possibilities. As they walked, Richard realized it wasn't just the girl who needed him. He needed her too, and this unlikely bond would be their strength for the days to come. His heart, once closed, was now like a garden ready to bloom again, ready to bear fruit. It was the rebirth of a man who had nearly lost himself. He took a deep breath, lifted his face to the sky, and smiled. The past could not be erased, but the future was in his hands. And this time he would not walk alone. The girl squeezed his hand and said, "Come on, we still have a long way to go." And Richard, for the first time in decades, felt like a child again, ready to start over. But deep down, he knew the greatest revelations were yet to come. Life had only shown the first page of this new story. Dear friend who's been with me this far, after reading this story, it's impossible not to reflect. How many times in your life have you felt alone in the midst of a storm? How many times have you believed there was no way out, until something unexpected brought new hope? Richard and that girl's journey shows us that it's never too late to transform our hearts. That even amidst the most painful and difficult memories, God can always give us a new beginning. But I ask you, have you ever experienced a moment that changed everything in a single instant? Maybe it was a word, a hug, or even a small gesture. Moments like these are etched in our souls and remind us that heaven always prepares encounters. That seems simple, but hold hidden miracles. And if you had the chance to start over today, what would you do differently? What promises left behind would you like to honor? Think about it, because life always offers us a new page to write. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt something similar? What would you do in Richard's shoes? Share in the comments, because your story might inspire others here with us. And if this message touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way you'll continue receiving stories that aren't just narratives. They're invitations to reflect, feel, and live with greater faith and hope. The best of life is yet to come, and I want to be by your side every step of the way.